We arrived late last week, and so when we and Rebecca talked, I had to ask her, what do you say about prayerful conversation? Because that could mean a whole lot of things. And so I wanted to start by reminding all of us what prayerful conversation is. In this moment, in this hour, God is our primary listener, not so much each other. And God already knows all the details and the nuances, and so we don't have to explain ourselves as thoroughly as we might to one another, because we're talking to God who already understands. And the beauty of that is that when we are listening to one another talk to God, we are likely to understand each other a little better, even without all the explanation and nuance. And so we're going to give ourselves more time to hear what's being said, even without words, as we begin. Let us start with prayer. Oh God, as we gather in this moment, open our hearts to your presence among us. Be in our words and in the spaces between our words. Guide our hearts and our minds to follow you more closely. Amen. The scripture chosen for today, I was delighted to see. This is one of my absolute favorites. It's highlighted in yellow in my Bible because I've used it for funerals many times. My color-coded Bible, Rainbow Bible, has nothing on me, is highlighted for the years of the lectionary, as well as for funeral and other useful passages to make them easy to find. Completely aside from the fact that it just kind of falls open to those now. Isaiah 43, do not remember the former things or consider the things of old. I'm about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. This comes from a portion of Isaiah that in academic circles is called Second Isaiah. The first 39 chapters of the book, roughly, are from the period of time when conflict reigned supreme in Jerusalem, but the exile had not yet happened. The kingdom had not yet been overrun. Chapters 40 to 55 or 40 to 66, depending on who you talk to, are generally seen as having come from a time period in exile when the folks had been carried off to Babylon, torn away from where God lived in their understanding, torn away from the homes and familiarity, from routines of life. It's not unlike our own time for many of us when we wonder, where is God? Who's in charge of all this if we can't find where God is? And periodically I need to move my mask so that I can still see. The curse of glasses and masks is a real thing. I wonder, can you put yourself for a moment in the place of an exiled follower of God in that ancient time? What would you most be wanting? What would your heart long for when you were in a strange land.
To go home. Home having different connotations.
Say more about that.
Home is where you probably were happier, had friends and family, and where you felt God was.
Mhm.
You probably feel that since you've been torn away, that God has abandoned you, or you've been torn away from Him.
Yeah.
Why doesn't He help you? Why did He let that happen?
Or you, God, why have you forsaken me? This section of Isaiah begins in Isaiah 40 with comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that she has served her time. Can't read that. Her penalty is paid. Does this sound like an answer to your heart's longing? Though, when it says, do not remember the former things or consider the things of old, how does that speak to a heart that feels displaced? I'm about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Can't you see it?
Old habits die hard.
Yeah.
I think it's asking for a shift in attention from what has been to what's ahead. Not that it's spelling out what's ahead, but it's saying something new is coming. It's almost saying, to me, it's saying, pay attention. Don't let yourself
It's a good way to think of it.
be stuck back.
Question, maybe I missed. Who is speaking here? Is it God or is it
This is
Isaiah?
God speaking.
It's God. Okay.
Mhm.
Through Isaiah.
Yes. Well, or one of Isaiah's disciples, but yes.
I'm thinking when the most recent women's movement was having consciousness raising
Mhm.
to don't live where it has been, but get ready and experience and almost dream about where you want to be.
Yes.
On Facebook especially, I've been noticing a lot of people who are expressing the kind of sense of exile that that I presuppose when I read Isaiah. The world has changed. And when did that happen? Who moved my cheese? If you remember that book. And so there's a great deal of angst, animosity toward people who are good with the change. And the people who don't like the change that has disrupted their comfortable lives are ready to go to war. It's, yeah, I very much imagined that there were some people who didn't really like Isaiah's message.
I mean, in exile, yeah, how much change is there going to be now? Right? Like, I've already had my whole entire life stripped away. And I'm supposed to look at the newness, you know, like, what are you saying? There's no promise of we'll go back to comfort, to home, right? And that's so frustrating versus people who, you know, some people are open to change. Like, okay, if this means not this, means something completely new, I'll take that new instead of exile.
Yeah.
Right. But there's, like you mentioned, there's that kind of, oh, I want what it used to be because it was so comforting and familiar. But for those whom that wasn't comforting or familiar, being at home, something new sounds great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even among clergy, the argument runs that full gamut, where some people are saying we're entering into a godless age, and other people who are saying, no, it's not a godless age. What I see happening is all about God. God is changing us, our circumstances. Oh my.
Yeah. When I think about this passage and the ways that I've called upon it in ministry over the course of a life's work, I think of how often the discussion has led back from here to Genesis 1. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void. As Rick Lowry would put it, it's the most chaotic chaos ever. And I imagine that's what exile feels like. But it's also in that time, in that kind of space, that God begins to create. And so whenever lives are in chaos, one of the things that I remind myself and say to others is, where is God creating something even better? Did I hear a wordless comment?
Just like-
Amen, I think.
Amen, and here comes the wrecking ball. I think of when an old apartment house comes down and something new is gonna happen on that big block. Everybody that drives by wonders what's it gonna be? Who's gonna, what's the use? What's the purpose?
Yeah. I hadn't thought about this in years. About 5 years, 6 years after I graduated from seminary, some of our professors started calling us to find out if they had done well by us, if our seminary education had been effective. And one of my classmates said to my faculty advisor, who had called me also, said to Bill, Professor Brian, I thought I knew what Jesus meant when he said all that stuff. But the more I know what Jesus said he meant, the more I feel like a stranger in his church. That's a kind of exile right there. And when I learned of that, immediately I heard the song in my head, I'm just a poor wayfaring stranger. And I haven't really felt all that much at home anywhere, because I'm a Christian in a world that claims him but doesn't know him. That's exile.
So I wonder, as we think about exile, how does exile prepare us to, I think this is on the inside of your folder. How does exile prepare us to perceive new things? And how does exile make us resist new things?
So your mind is closed, your heart is closed, you're fearful maybe, or you are not happy with the source of information. Well, and they know what they're talking about. I know that, but three different things. So those things would get in the way of perceiving these.
I heard one word in particular that resonates for me, when we're in exile, I think fear is often a huge component of the way that we see everything. And when we're living in fear, we tend to live with blinders on.
Yeah.
We can see home or comfort or whatever it was, but it's hard to see the whole expanse
Beyond that.
of God at work.
And I think also grief and loss and shock. You can hang out there way past what's moving on and recovery. Exile, everybody wants to go home, and that may not, that's the expectation in the whole, rather than moving on and forging all new everything's, traveling,
Going ahead
going ahead,
rather than going
Yeah.
back.
yeah, looking back. Yeah,
It would have been better for us if we had died in Egypt.
yeah, never been born.
Yeah.
But it's still somewhere God's whispering, no.
Yeah.
This is a new yes,
Mhm.
yeah.
So today, praying for our pastors is the primary focus. And we're talking about exile and this matter of longing for home, whatever that was, as a block for the new things God is doing. How do the pressures of exile make it harder for our pastors and ourselves as church leaders, but especially our pastors, to lead and to carry out ministry? How do these pressures stifle the grace and wisdom and creativity that will nurture and benefit us all?
You hear one of the criticisms of ministers quite often in don't get
There you go.
involved out there. Concentrate on exactly what the Bible says. And that's a difficult one. How can a person that is a minister just concentrate on the Bible? They can use the Bible to look at what's going on around them. But if they look at things around them, then somebody in the audience is going to be critical of, well, I don't agree with that,
Okay.
and I don't agree with this, but maybe I agree with this. So now the minister has to figure out to try to keep his audience or her audience, has to kind of figure out all these different factors. And the easy way sometimes is go right back to the Bible and don't go beyond that, and don't use examples of everyday life, which of course I like. I like the idea of using, but that's my thought.
Your comment just brought to mind.
Yes, Cheryl.
Oh,
Well, this is discursive. It's not a direct answer, I think, to your question, Renee, but it just made me ponder the different types of exile that a pastor might be experiencing. You know, typically pastors move from different churches to different churches, none of which may have anything to do with where they started in life. Or where they started in ministry either. And then Steve brought up
I can tell you, San Diego is a long way from Eureka, Illinois.
I don't think so, exactly. And then Steve brought up the less literal, I guess, kind of example of feeling in exile as a Christian. That there's that difference between actual and proclaimed values where Christianity can be widely proclaimed, but not lived in spirit. So if a pastor is trying to live in spirit, trying to lead in spirit, trying to model in spirit, but the world around does not seem to be doing that, that's a sort of exile that's hard for others to see and reach into sometimes, I would think. So not a direct answer to your question, just kind of a thinking about ways of being exiled as a pastor.
Absolutely.
Do we expect our ministers to make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert? And are we disappointed when they're not able to do it? And are they stifled because they know they can't do it? They can't come up with solutions like Isaiah does, smart, bold solutions. I would say that stifles creativity.
Oh, yeah.
One thing you said there too, kind of, I don't know how important it is, but when a minister goes this way to try to find a solution, like you said, and it's a difficult solution, maybe we're asking for solutions when really we're looking at maybe chipping off at that solution a little bit. In other words, it's a working towards that solution. That's the important part. And it'd be great, but in our world, a lot of people want solutions as we speak right now. We want the Iraq war to end. We want the Iraqis to be happy again. We want their cities rebuilt again, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm sorry, what did I say? You're right. Oh, sorry, wrong war.
Well, it's still the same thing though,
It does.
you know, it's still the
It
same.
applies.
Mhm.
And I have a feeling quite often some of the ministers' flock doesn't like the river where it might be put, or doesn't like the way in the wilderness, to go that way in the wilderness. I want to go some other way. Sure.
Mhm.
I think Cheryl said in response to that, because that expectation would be what only God can do, not necessarily what the pastor can do.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking, is so often the confessional moment here, speaking as a former congregational pastor. Sometimes the congregation expects you to do what only God can do. When our role is perhaps more accurately viewed as standing with the congregation to say, look, I think maybe God is at work over there. Let's try that direction.
Yeah.
But if the expectation is, no, you show us with certainty where God is. Or you be God because we can't see God.
Now, it's easy to forget that pastors are human, you know, and their capabilities only reach so far because they have to go through prayer, but still, they're still human. You know, so I think that expectations are sometimes way too high. So
We want grace and wisdom and creativity from our pastors. But the times that we allow for them to lead and that we give them the grace and wisdom and creativity are much fewer. We tend to demand what we have no right to expect.
But then sometimes I think that, I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt you. That we can kind of be mini ministers,
Can you say that loud?
that we can be mini ministers. You know, not expect the minister to do everything, but you know, okay, here's your team and we're mini ministers and we're in there, you know, it's like the general with the soldiers. you know, the general can't do anything unless he has soldiers, really, so. But many minutes, I think I just made it up. I think I like that.
We have a senior coffee that's made up of some rather interesting individuals, including myself on Wednesdays. And we are very strong in our political views. There are conservatives in the group and there are liberals in the group. And it gets pretty exciting on occasion. We go for an hour. One of the things I've noticed with our group is that, and there's some really bright people in that group, but some of the ways what I've noticed is we don't necessarily agree, but we listen to each other, we yell at each other. But generally, the feeling is when we leave, I think with most of them, that this was a good discussion. May not agree with John over there, but I might agree more with Michael or Ray or whatever the case may be. But we've all kicked it out. We've hit it out there, and it can go anywhere.
And it's
Me-
worthy to hear different viewpoints.
That's right.
And
That's
continue
the
in
key.
connection.
Different viewpoints and some pretty intellectual answers on both sides of how things are. And it can go anywhere. We do not have an agenda. Well, somebody might have. Somebody might walk in and say, well, I'll tell you what I think of you, blank liberals. And that maybe starts a conversation. But in reality, it opens up. It can be sports, it can be any kind of thing, but we do like the idea of talking and express our issues. How much we solve, I don't know, but it's important, I think, to talk about.
And I think in that group, there's a common understanding that you respect and care for one another. There's a sort of a mutual,
Camaraderie,
what,
camaraderie.
yeah, I think so. So I think that makes it easier to get past those, big divides that are there sometimes.
And you've just expressed what late in my life I've come to realize is probably key to helping pastors. When the lay leaders of a congregation and the common average church attender, when they speak their mind,
Yeah.
instead of staying mum, then the pastor begins to recognize the movement of God much better and has an opportunity to influence toward God much better. One of the churches I served that was caught in a rut and was not moving from that comfortable rut suddenly broke free when an elder confronted me right after her worship one Sunday with a question. Why do you keep telling us what Jesus taught when nothing that he taught has any relevance for today? And this was an elder. I said, Clyde, you bring that question to the next meeting of the elders, and let's discuss it there. And oh my gosh, it broke free in the midst of that very first conversation. And they did not like to be impinged by that rut anymore. And Clyde discovered how relevant the teachings of Jesus really were, not from me, but from a number of other people. I suspect that might be what happened during the exile in Babylon. People started expressing their doubt, and other people began to express their faith and their hope. And all of a sudden, creativity broke out. And they invented Judaism and the synagogue. Powerful.
So if grace, wisdom, creativity, and I would add one more thing. Courage. Courage to follow the path. If those are the things we want to see from our pastors, What stifles that?
What
What
was
do
that
we
last
need?
part? What?
What stifles
Okay.
that? What do we stop to allow for this to happen? And what do we do to encourage it?
I was thinking towards that at the last question, because it seems to me it has to be held gently but firmly within the whole body, that ministers and congregations and all of us need Sabbath rest and creativity and the
Catch
church,
that word.
Sabbath rest, a real
Sabbath.
Sabbath.
Sunday. rest.
I mean, the
Sunday.
concept
Okay.
of Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
And at church, that's when we do most of our work.
Yeah.
We don't just come to worship, but we have committee meetings and we have feasts and we have so many things. But if a church doesn't recall and a pastor doesn't remind and the congregation doesn't remind pastor, maybe we should just take a break from this for a minute or a week, or let's table this. Does this have to be decided tonight when spirits get high? And oftentimes in my experience, it would be that little old lady that hardly ever spoke up at council meeting would say, we have to decide this tonight.
Oh, yeah.
And everything's, no. And leaving room for God or creativity, or the example of how Jesus ministry was not really at the synagogue. His ministry was with the people, and he was always getting interrupted. And he hardly ever blew his cool. Sometimes it's good to be able to do that. But I think Jesus is relevant and God is present. But if we just get too wound up in our own agenda, we may miss how to be church. I think whatever decade we're in, one of our key roles as church leaders and as clergy, whether we're lay people or if we've been to the seminary, is to remember we're not God. We're the people of God. And how do we, sometimes just breaking out in song or saying, you know, it's been a long time since we had a potluck. Or why don't we just play softball next month? Or what, you know, how many want to go fishing? Where do we find rest and renewal? And a lot of things that we spend an awful lot of time worrying about, arguing about, just really aren't as relevant as they seem. I don't know, it's because it's in scripture. They're always going off to pray, and they're always going off to have some meals together. And they're always holding it together for centuries. And I think creativity is key, but so is civility. You can get angry. You can turn over tables, but you shouldn't annihilate human beings with shame or.
Turning over tables can be fun.
Yeah.
Speaking for myself, I wouldn't dare speak for Rebecca or any other pastor. But during my own time in congregational ministry, as opposed to regional ministry, one of the most soul stifling things that I would get caught up in is a set of activities that I would call feeding the bureaucracy. And that encompassed all kinds of stuff that ate up time, but did not serve the kingdom. Things like covering for the secretary because the secretary was gone, so I had to answer the phone, which led to all of this other stuff, keeping the calendar up to date and sending a message to this person and receiving a message from that person, you know, being that hub. Which meant that the day that I was going to use in thinking and praying and looking ahead on sermons, which can be its own kind of hell, but it also but it also is a way to let the mind free to be thinking on the things of God and asking, what's next? Where are we going next, God? Letting the minutia get in the way of the big stuff is the soul killing thing. Having to spend 3 hours sorting out a schedule for this, that, and the other thing, because the person who was supposed to do it couldn't do it. For whatever reason that might be. But it had to be done, so I did it. Now, does this sound like any pastor you've ever heard? Or every pastor you've ever known?
My dad especially.
That is the kind of thing that for one day is not an issue. There's always another day. But day after day after day, all of these non-issues become
The whole
huge.
thing, yeah, big one, partner.
And they eat up all the time available because it's really hard to carve out time to say, no, this is God's time on my calendar.
Take note, Tessa.
Yeah. Yeah. And the flip side of that is that sometimes those visions of God that you had scheduled for Tuesday afternoon from 1 to 5 happen in the middle of choir practice on Wednesday instead. That's the irony, is that you have to schedule it, but you can't schedule it. But it's that gets in the way of creativity. It sucks up the energy that you use to express grace.
Yeah.
It gets in the way of being able to see the wise thing.
It's hard to operate gracefully when you're running on empty.
Yeah.
And I think church leaders and clergy have to remind each other together. I think it's time for a spa day, or, whatever. I mean, we have to say to one another, all right, come on, Hazel, we're getting in the Oldsmobile and we're going for a drive, or, whatever. How do we do that for each other?
Yeah.
We're on the Sea of Galilee. Okay, boys, push off from shore. We're going into deep waters now.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just, it has to be, you have to keep a good sense of humor. And sometimes
You
people don't
remind me
want
of
that.
a
Yeah.
quote from Bishop Spong that I've seen floating on Facebook recently. That says, just like in the swimming pool, most of the noise in church comes from the shallow end.
Ooh.
Oh,
When I read that, I thought,
Oh, my goodness.
Not just church.
Oh,
Not just church, right, Cheryl?
Oh,
Yeah.
golly, golly.
It makes a lot of sense, because when you're in the shallow end, you're standing there, you're hollering, you're thinking and so forth, and you're carrying forward. But when you're in the deep end, you're concentrating on staying above the water.
Exactly.
And any breath you take is going to be to stay up and take a stroke, or whatever the case may be. Unless you're a real accomplished swimmer, then maybe you can stay in the deep
yeah,
end.
if you're in the deep end, you're immersed in the water and doing what you're there to do.
And you're there with a very few accomplished swimmers.
Correct.
In the shallow end,
Party time.
not very many swimmers.
I like that much.
Mhm.
Screamers
Sure.
is the
John
operative
Shelby
word here.
Spong had a lot to say to the church that challenged us.
Yeah.
Cheryl has, I think, something she wanted to say.
Oh, thank you. Cheryl?
I was just going to point out a little earlier that I think that both you and Mariana make a really good point, and the commonality of the point seems to be about making space, which is kind of what centering prayer is about too, but in a different, maybe not a different kind of way, but that you're addressing the idea of needing to make space, whether that's metaphorical or spiritual or internal or physical, that we need to make some space, that we're not filling up with agendas and ego and minutia, as you said.
Also, getting back to your point about courage, knowing when to say something, not waiting too long.
Yeah,
But being graceful and prayerful about when. I'm thinking of a church member years ago that after coffee hour one day said, Mariana, I've got a bone to pick with you. So, and nobody in church had ever said that to me, but I'd grown up with people that said that to each other every once in a while, and I knew what Clem meant. So I said, well, Clem, could I come over for coffee tomorrow? And he said, that'd be great. And it wasn't a huge thing, but it was a very important thing. But I learned from Clem, we need to tell each other when somebody's on our toes.
Yep.
Or if we see something, or even hear something in conversation, sometimes right then is the time to say, well, I don't agree with that. We need to talk further on that. Let's find a time. All those kinds of ways that help us. And then when somebody says that to us, or when somebody uses a different tone with us, if somebody's always cheery and then they're a little chilly, we have to watch for the how, yes,
The nonverbal
they're not
signals.
exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, how to stay in community prayerfully.
you listen to the words and you listen between the words.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I remember hearing people here say to one another, are we still okay about that? I can't remember, but that was kind of a tone that I'd hear. Is that all right with you? Is that,
Yeah,
but
Mhm.
those
Yeah.
kind of check-in.
Yeah.
And are important.
it's a good thing.
Our time is nearing its end. Are there things that you would like to lift up for prayer that come out of what we have been saying to God and to one another during this last half hour or so?
I'm gonna lift up the fact that whenever I read these words, wisdom, creativity, and now courage, I think about the way I've watched Pastor Rebecca and our ministerial assistant move through this very difficult time. And I think both have shown enormous creativity and courage and grace and wisdom too, probably, but the creativity has really been present in a time when it hasn't been an easy couple years.
It has not been.
So that's, I guess, if we're, thinking joy and concern, that's a real joy to me. And to see the way that Welcome Saturday got adapted and moved on and didn't shut down in a tough time. That's really, I've been so impressed with how people stepped up and kept it going.
The pandemic caused a demand on creativity that is unprecedented in my lifetime. And what a well-worn word that is. But so much had to happen in such a short span of time, and then it had to keep on happening, that I can't imagine how many pastors have just succumbed. As that all was beginning, I retired at the end of 2019. And we moved here at the end of 2019. And as the pandemic was going on, I kept thinking about the colleagues I left behind in Kansas. And thinking two things simultaneously. One was, oh, I retired just in time. And the other was overwhelming guilt for, oh my goodness, how are they managing with all of that? Not sure which one won. But the plight of those still in the harness was very much on my mind through all of this.
And I kept thinking, what a wonderful thing this pandemic is. Because it's forcing a whole lot of church leaders to recognize the value of the younger generation and their ability to work with Zoom and other
Yes.
such
Technologies.
tools to help the church to become a new thing. It's not that I despair of my own generation, but I did despair of our inability or unwillingness to welcome the younger generation in. And this forced the issue in many places.
Well, what other thoughts do you have for prayer?
I have one, to be willing, to be okay with okay.
Uh-huh.
Mhm.
Yeah,
To just be, yeah.
yeah.
Not everything must be the best.
That's right. And there's a difference between mediocrity and wholesomely acceptable.
Yeah,
You know, I was raised by perfectionists.
Mhm.
And then one time, just about 10 or 12 years ago, I was in a quilt shop in Oregon and I heard two little old ladies. One said to the other, now Hazel, finished is better than perfect. And that's become I've gotten a lot more done since I overheard that. And some people said, oh, they were raised with that. But when you have to keep tearing something out to make it perfect, you finally get it so limp it can't do what it was gonna do in the first place.
Yeah.
mhm.
So I mean, COVID has really unleashed a lot of that. Some people have stepped up that normally couldn't be shamed into doing something. But I don't know, it's some great good has come out of the
Yes.
upheaval.
Right, right.
Yeah. Acceptance.
The prayer prompts are on the back page of your leaflet. Let's spend some time in silence, praying for the people God is preparing to join our church family. Praying for ourselves to see when okay is sufficient. Not everything must be gold plated. Praying for eyes to see the way that God is at work in unexpected places. We never expect to see a river in the desert, but it may be there. Pray in your hearts to find the way in the wilderness. Pray in silence, listening for the voices that aren't yet being heard. Pray in thanksgiving for all the ways that God's providence has brought us thus far. Pray for an open heart to see God at work today and tomorrow in our pastors, in our leaders, in ourselves. Now, to the end of our days and beyond. Amen.